While we're waiting for people to come on, I would like to invite those audience members who are here to use the Q&A function to share with us how you were feeling about the environmental crisis and how you were coping. Welcome to our UCSF Earth Week kickoff event, Generation Climate. We are thrilled beyond belief at having an amazing, talented, and prolific panel of speakers who will use the movie Don't Look Up as a springboard to talk about the many ramifications of the current climate and environmental crises. Before I introduce them, I want to send out appreciations to the team who helped make it possible. First, the UCSF Climate Change and Mental Health Task Force Education Subcommittee, including Dr. Michelle Porsche and Dr. Sandy Pepper. Facilitating tonight are committee members Dr. Robin Cooper, founder of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, and Anne-Marie Charlesworth, director of the UCSF Earth Center Community Engagement Corps. And myself, Mary Burke, medical director of the UCSF Trauma Recovery Center. Thank you also to Gail Lee and Elizabeth Lynn of the UCSF Office of Sustainability, and our technical team, Kyle Van Auker and Isaac Conway Stenzel, and to medical student Neha Pondicherry for a cool climate challenge. Don't Look Up is a satire that caught the nation's attention last winter. It tells the story of the futile efforts of three scientists trying to warn the world of a planet killer comet that is hurtling towards the Earth. After a lot of government grandstanding, the forces of corporate greed and political corruption lead to cataclysm. It is also a brilliant way to broach the scary subject of the unfolding climate crisis. Here to talk about that tonight are our fabulous speakers. Dear panelists, as I introduce you, please tell us something about the movie you would like us to reflect on or pay attention to, or any other thoughts for our audience. Daniel Heinerfeld directs the Natural Resources Defense Council's Rewrite the Future, an initiative to help Hollywood tell stories about the climate crisis. He's an Emmy-winning filmmaker who founded NRDC's documentary unit and was formerly an editor, producer, and reporter at NPR. He is a consultant to Netflix, and that included Don't Look Up.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, Mary. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. You know, just very quickly, I would say, as you watch the excerpts from the film, think about it in emotional terms. I think it's worth reflecting on what are the emotions it engenders in you? What are the feelings you think other audience members are experiencing because of it? And I am interested in the emotions that motivated it, you know, for Adam McKay and the rest of the team that made it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Britt Ray, PhD, is a human and planetary health postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, as well as the author of the book Generation Dread, Finding Purpose in an Age of Climate Crisis. She has worked with Netflix on educational materials around the release of Don't Look Up. Welcome, Britt.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm honored to be here and enjoying this film again. I've watched it many times and I'm excited to dig in with all of you today. I would just like to build on what Daniel was saying there. I think it's really intriguing and important to reflect on how this film really highlights the stakes on a psychological level of what it means to live with the awareness day in and day out of existential threat. I think that that's why this film has been so cathartic for many in the climate community to watch, to see themselves reflected in terms of their frustrations, our frustrations, as well as our emotional distress that comes with working on this enormous problem. And it says some, you know, troubling things about our culture as well, that it has taken so long to have such reflections at Hollywood scale in a blockbuster, given how long we've been dealing with the crisis it took until this year. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Lisa Fortuna, MD, MPH, and Masters of Divinity, is the Chief of Psychiatry and Vice Chair at Z San Francisco General Hospital and Professor of Clinical Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UCSF. She served as an expert mental health consultant to a post-Hurricane Maria task force in Puerto Rico. She is a member of the UC Climate Change and Mental Health Task Force and helps lead its clinical care and community relations work group. Welcome, Lisa.
Right, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I would say the thing that struck me the most, which I wonder what people might think if they sort of dived in, is, you know, how do we need to think critically, right, about sort of the power structures and the things that can numb us to really looking at what is really happening and who's being affected by climate change and other things that are so impactful. So how can we look at that critically, our sort of political and societal discourse on how we respond to these things?
Thank you. Abe Singh Sachal is a Canadian climate activist and a student at the University of Toronto. He is the co-founder and executive director of Break the Divide, a global nonprofit that connects young people to inspire local action. Abe was recently named one of Canada's top 25 under 25 environmentalists and featured as the 2019 Canada's Walk of Fame Community Hero Award winner. Welcome, Abe.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. And it's an honor to be sharing the stage with such climate mental health rock stars. And for everyone here today, I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I'd really say that, you know, while the movie itself doesn't have the happiest of endings, I'd implore everyone to think throughout this discussion as you watch the movie. What roles do you hold in your own community, and what communities do you hold space in? And within those communities, how can you create the resilience and hope that's necessary to create the future that we want, not the future that the movie ends up with, because there is hope. And I'm excited to talk all about that today.
Thank you. Wow. Finally, but certainly not least, is Grace Nosek, who is a legal scholar, youth climate justice organizer, and storyteller. She is a PhD candidate in law and the founder of the Climate Hub at the University of British Columbia. And she holds a law degree from Harvard Law School and a master's of laws from UBC. She has published a trilogy of hopeful climate fantasy, the Ava of the Gaia series, among her many accomplishments. Welcome, Grace.
Thank you so much. I absolutely love that you folks got together, cared about this, and then put the panel together. I just think that's such a model of what we need in this moment. People turning to their colleagues and their loved ones and showing up where they can, as a few other folks have mentioned. One of the things that I find so interesting is how packed the movie was. And why I find that so interesting is because I think people are leaping at the chance to bring their gifts to climate action. They don't know how they can show up, but they want to show up with their joy and their talent. And so here we have all these actors. I mean, if you think about the names in that movie, they didn't have to sign off. It would have been hard to get them all in one place. And so I'm like constantly scheming about how I can help folks bring what they want to learn, what they want to build, who they want to be connecting with in climate action.
Thank you. We have some wonderful things to get us started, and I'm now going to turn it over to Anne-Marie.
Thank you so much, Mary. And it's just a real pleasure and honor to be with such an incredible group of people. I'd like to start our discussion with a question specifically to Lisa and Abe. Both been really on the front lines of the mental health fallout of the climate crisis. And I was wondering if you can both speak a little bit about your work in this area.
Yeah, thank you, Anne-Marie and Lisa. I guess I'll get started there. I think there was a bit of an audio issue there, but you know, to echo back your question in case folks didn't hear that, and hopefully we can get the tech issue figured out on the back end. I think the mental health experiences of climate change are so nuanced. And I mean, I'd love to invite actually Lisa to start with this, with the experience and expertise that you bring. And Lisa, I think you're muted.
Thank you. So the question is sort of the psychological impact, right, of the climate change. I want to start from sort of a perspective of, if I can, in terms of my experience in Puerto Rico and then also being here, because I think the juxtaposition is interesting around how I experience, and I think people experience things in different settings and situations, right? So in Puerto Rico, when we had a Hurricane Maria, which a lot of people know about in 2017 already, people saw that as a real sort of acute event, but it was an event that was just one on top of a series of events, right? Of sort of ongoing persistent climate change and worsening storms and more frequent storms, but also embodied or sort of overlapped on a sort of a long history of, frankly, colonialism, right, and colonization of an island where it was left very vulnerable in terms of its infrastructure and economic capacity to manage those things. But at the same time, I think that what I learned in Puerto Rico in terms of how people were managing psychologically was that there's been a long period of resistance and activism around climate change and environmental justice that has been sort of multi-generational, and it's elders and young people, and that's, you know, one of the organizations that's really sort of known for this in Puerto Rico is Casa Pueblo, which won the Goldman Environmentalist Award in 2002 for blocking gold mining in the mountains around their town. Worked around cleaning up Vieques, which was being having nuclear pollution because of the military doing bombing practices within Vieques Islands, completely changing the ecosystem. So they've had like a long history of colonization and disempowerment, but a long history of resistance. And so there have been tremendous leaders in trying to sort of clean up Vieques, moving away from fossil fuel, also moving more to solar energy and disconnecting, you know, some more renewable energy, and a movement towards really going towards what I would say traditional ways of farming and doing things that re-engage people in their culture and in what we know to do in terms of overcoming hurricanes. And I always tell people, huracán is a Taino word that came from the Taino Indians in Puerto Rico that means hurricane. So people have known hurricanes for a really long time, and they know how to farm and they know how to sort of, you know, do things ecologically. And people are moving back to that. And the reason I talk about this in regards to mental health is because it is that sort of going back to sort of our roots and our resilience and resistance and culture that I think has really created some environment of hope in Puerto Rico. And there's massively sort of people coming into sort of different ways of farming, and women coming more into farming, and families and young people sort of getting back and sort of connected to what is really happening and what we can do, I think is really critical for mental health. And we don't always have that here, right? Where we feel more disconnected, I think, to our environment and our agency. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that connection and resilience piece is critical. Much of my work has been around the youth impacts of the climate crisis. And so the evidence is very clear. Research from, you know, some folks on this panel, I know Britt was a part of a landmark study that showed that 10,000 youth across the world are experiencing anxiety, mental health issues, ecological grief, burnout because of the climate crisis. And so that data is very clear. And my kind of initial exposure to this came from my initial connection to the environment. Growing up on the West Coast of BC in Canada, you know, I had the nature on one side, trees, water on the other, and then I was surrounded by the mountains and everything else, and it was beautiful. And in 2016, I had this incredible opportunity to travel to the Canadian and Greenlandic Arctic, and I saw the impacts of climate change firsthand. So I was on an expedition with 200 people from around the world, scientists, historians, musicians, at 14 years old. And there was this one moment at the Ilulissat Ice Fjord in Greenland. So this is a place where you can close your eyes and you can see ice stretched out for kilometers and kilometers, miles and miles, as far as your eyes can see. And all 200 of us in that moment went silent for a moment. And we could literally hear the icebergs melting. And so at 14 years old, I was overwhelmed, inundated with feelings of hopelessness, anxiety, and I felt like the burden of solving climate change was on my shoulders. And I talked to my Inuit peers. So the Inuit are indigenous to the Arctic. They've been in the Arctic since time immemorial, and learning from my friends that are indigenous to the Arctic, my Inuit friends, I learned that while there has been an immense ecological grief associated with what Lisa talked about, some of the loss associated with colonialism, the imposition of climate change, the loss of culture and local practices. What really inspired me was the resilience in spite of this and how local communities had been adapting, how the Inuit have been adapting for the past 20, 30 years, because climate change in the Arctic is not a new thing. And so learning from my friends was absolutely inspirational for me. And that's really what got me on the path of using empathy and informed approaches to connect young people from different parts of the world to engage in dialogue about the climate crisis, talk about our mental health, and use that empathy and shared inspiration to take action. So the mental health impacts of the climate crisis are clear. And I hope through this panel, we can really dive into those impacts, but also discuss those factors of resilience and community building.
Thank you so much, Ebe. I'm hoping my audio is better now. Okay.
Yeah, Andrea, I don't want to jump in, but I hope, I don't think it's just on my end. It looks like the audio
No, it's
is
hard to
intermittent.
hear.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I
How
can jump.
how about I show our first, oh no, we wanted to hear
Yeah.
from Britt and her study. Britt, are you there to share with us about your
Yeah.
study?
Absolutely. Thank you, Abe, for setting it up. So some colleagues and I did a global survey of climate anxiety in 10,000 youth in 10 very different countries around the world, spanning low, middle, and high income settings and different ranges of exposure to climate hazards. So specifically, we looked at Australia, Brazil, Finland, France, India, Nigeria, Philippines, Portugal, the UK, and the US. We were trying to understand the psychological impacts of climate change on young people, their severity, the burden, and then also their thoughts about government action. And what we found even shocked and alarmed those of us who are mired in climate and mental health research day in, day out. So 45% of the global respondents said that climate change negatively affects their daily life and functioning. So when we're talking about impaired functioning, that means disrupting young people's ability to eat, concentrate, go to work, go to school, play or have fun, be in relationships, basically be an easeful young person. We're talking about 16 to 25-year-olds, 10,000 of them around the world. 75% of them said that the future is frightening, which is a very high number, of course. More than 50% feel that humanity is doomed. And that's a very, very heavy statistic to land in your heart when you consider that many young people are walking around that way, feeling this sense of foreboding, inescapable danger for their own lives and that of this greater species we're all a part of. More than 50% said that they won't have access to the same opportunities their parents had and that the things they most value in life will be destroyed. Now, 39% of these young people said that the climate crisis makes them hesitant to have their own children. And so it's really, again, expressing the existential stakes that we've briefly talked about. And this is rolling back to have big mental health concerns and impacts in their lives. The top 3 reported emotions were being sad, 67% of them, being afraid, again, 67% of these young people, or being anxious, 62%. But importantly, it wasn't just that young people were declaring that they're having this disrupted functioning because the environment isn't doing well and they're feeling very climate anxious. Importantly, these findings were significantly correlated with the sense that they're being lied to by leaders and betrayed by those put in positions of power who are meant to protect them but are failing to do that work. And so what we're really talking about here is a direct link between mental health impacts and institutional betrayal, moral injury, and it outlines the need for adults to step into taking this very seriously and trying to repair that social fabric which is breaking down across the generations.
I'm hoping my volume is now fixed. Can you give me a little head nod, Britt? Okay, great. Yay, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna do a little segue here to a video clip from Don't Look Up, and then we'll come back and continue the conversation. So sit back and enjoy, and we'll talk to you in a few minutes.
Oh, I heard there's an asteroid or a comet or something that you don't like the looks of. Tell me about it, and then tell me why you're telling me about it. You got 20 minutes.
20 minutes?
That's you, Doc. Go.
Madam President, approximately 36 hours ago, PhD candidate Kate DiBiase here discovered a very large comet.
Oh, good for you.
A comet between 5 to 10 kilometers across that we estimate came from the Oort cloud.
Wow.
Which is the outermost part of the solar system. And using Gauss's method of orbital determination and the average astrometric uncertainty of 0.04 arc seconds, we then asked...
Whoa, what the hell is
so
what?
bored. Just tell us what it is. Seriously, stop.
Stop
What Dr. Mindy is trying to say is that there's a comet headed directly towards Earth. And according to NASA's computers, that object is going to hit the Pacific Ocean at 62 miles due west off the coast of Chile.
And then what happens, like a tidal wave?
No, it will be far more catastrophic. There will be mile-high tsunamis fanning out all across the globe. If this comet makes impact, it will have the power of a billion Hiroshima bombs. There will be magnitude 10 or 11 earthquakes.
You're breathing weird. It's making me uncomfortable.
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to articulate the science.
I know, but it's like so stressful. I like trying to like listen.
I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. I'm trying to articulate it the best I can. I don't know.
Madam President, this comet is what we call a planet killer.
That is correct.
Mm-hmm. So how certain is this?
There's 100% certainty of impact.
Please, don't say 100%.
Can we just call it a potentially significant event?
Yeah.
Yes.
But it isn't potentially going to happen. It is going to happen.
Exactly, 99.78% to be exact.
Oh, great. Okay, so it's not 100%.
Well, scientists never like to say 100%.
Call it 70% and let's move on.
But it's not even close to 70%.
You cannot go around saying to people that there's 100% chance that they're going to die. You know, it's just nuts.
So just before I ask our panelists the next question, I want to personally chuckle at this one because I actually work with a lot of scientists, and I can tell you that this kind of communication is not always easy. You have to keep saying, "What are you telling me?" So I'd like to ask Dan and Grace specifically if they can talk about the role of entertainment in climate communication. What are the strengths and what are the limitations? And maybe, I don't know if either of you, Dan, you're already unmuted if you want to go ahead, but you're also welcome to unmute and discuss together. So please take it away.
Sure, thanks. It's so hard to start and stop watching the movie because it's so much fun. You know, I wanted to talk first about the film and then get more general about kind of climate and entertainment. In my job directing Rewrite the Future for NRDC, I'm out in Hollywood constantly, you know, talking with creative professionals, writers, creative producers, and others about how to tell climate stories and trying to expand the definition of what it means to tell a climate story. And, you know, I've heard the same story over and over again from so many of them, which is that, you know, writers and producers have been out in Hollywood in years past pitching climate stories to executives. And in a couple of minutes, it's kind of like in this scene, the executives' eyes glaze over and it's like they're not even, you know, in the room anymore. And, you know, there really has been this perception in Hollywood from the beginning that climate change is just not good at the box office poison, you know. And what's weird about that is that there's some very strong evidence to the contrary, right? So there haven't been that many climate films that are really focused on climate. And the ones that we've seen have been pretty darn successful. I mean, you think about Day After Tomorrow, which made $500 million in the US alone. You look at a movie like Avatar, which is not specifically about climate change, but very generally about, humanity's relationship to nature. It's the highest grossing film of all time. But, this idea has persisted in Hollywood that you want to stay away from this topic. And part of that is for creative reasons, and part of it is for commercial reasons. But in general, climate is viewed as divisive, depressing, preachy, boring, abstract, monolithic, and I think that none of that is necessarily true at all. And in fact, the opposite, I think, is true in many cases. And this film really helped explode, I think, some of those myths. And so that's terrific. I mean, just to talk about the business for a second, this film is the second most watched movie on Netflix ever. And it has, at this point, been watched somewhere between 300 and 400 million hours on the system. So it's gargantuan. And, I think that it has changed the discussion in Hollywood to some extent about what is possible and what is financially what's financially feasible. So I just wanted to sort of mention that. Earlier today, I was talking with a senior development executive at one of the major media companies, and he said, this movie will result in much more climate storytelling in Hollywood. There's no question about it. And there's this other view in Hollywood that, well, it's not because this movie is about climate that it was successful. It's because it was created by this genius auteur. And I think both are true, right? I think that it is touching a raw nerve, absolutely. And it's a very, very clever and inventive movie. I just, I think wanted to, and Grace, I will make way for you in 1 second. I just wanted to say that, to me, the movie is, it's a very angry movie. It's a movie that sort of made me angry and maybe provided some catharsis for me. I view it as like a movie for angry liberals, and it's like Dr. Strangelove. That comparison has been made. It's a dark, hilarious satire. It's kind of this rollicking black comedy, and I think what it's doing is in part, it's doing a lot of things, but it's expressing this pent up rage that many of us have at the science and climate denial in this country, and the lethal corporate greed, and the deeply corrupt and intellectually bankrupt political leadership that we have. And I think all of that is terrific. It's been pointed out by some people, and there's a little bit of research beginning to come out to sort of support this, that the movie was also very alienating to conservatives. And I don't know what to make of that, because whether to trust the numbers, because when you look at the sort of viewership that the movie had on Netflix, it's hard to imagine that a large percentage of them were pissed off and switching off, the TV. But there is some research saying that conservatives exhibited meaningful backlash because of the movie, that their support for climate action decreased by like 15%. And, I think I'll stop here because I just want to make way for Grace, but I think that we need all kinds of movies that express liberal rage, and movies that appeal to people who don't believe in climate change, but are somehow getting them that message. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit more later.
Yeah, awesome.
That was awesome. And I want to, if you have thoughts or comments or questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and our panelists can address them as we go, and we'll also have time at the end. Grace, would you please answer the question? Thank you for your patience.
Oh, of course. I thought that was a wonderful answer.
It was very good.
So like the one thing unanimously agreed upon across sectors is that we have the financial and technological solutions to climate change. What we don't have is the political will to put them in place fast enough. And the best way to build political will is stories. That's people talking to one another, moving one another, shifting the culture. And yet what we see is this really interesting thing. There is really compelling research out there that almost all of funding gets poured into technical solutions to climate change, and very little gets poured into either social sciences, which would be the behavioral change and the amazing work that Britt is doing. Britt, that research was wild. If you could even pop a link into that for me in the Q&A, I would love to see it. That also stories get very little funding. And so Daniel mentioned he's at Rewrite the Future at NRDC. I love that this environmental nonprofit had kind of the future vision to start investing in telling climate stories. It's not a typical thing for a big environmental nonprofit in the US to do. And they've been doing that now for several years. So if you're thinking about, investing either time, money, or energy in the climate movement, I would really encourage you to think about storytelling. Some of these other things that get passed on because they don't seem like they have return on investment in the same way as reducing carbon emissions or built environment or these other things, because they are just vastly, vastly, vastly underfunded. And there are artists out there who want to tell these stories in every possible way, in every possible medium. So we know stories are so critical to build political will. Some of the limitations of entertainment, for the movie, I think the big critique, of course, is that it centers white folks in who's on the front lines of communicating this. And we know, as some other panels have been mentioning, that that's not the case, that it's really been this Indigenous-led resistance, racialized folks, frontline communities who have been telling new stories, different stories of how we could be, and also raising the alarm about climate change and directing some of our answers. Of course, one movie can't do that all. As Daniel said, this was one movie. And so it's sometimes funny to read the critiques. I'm like, wow, I think we put more on this movie than we've asked of our governments to do on climate action. But the other thing is that there's so many ways to tell story, and social media has now opened up this wild forum where you can tell stories with very little money or resource or other things. And that's kind of what I've been exploring, because I work with young people. And we know that the best way to fight climate anxiety is action and empowerment for young people. And so I've been really playing with the ideas of how do we let young people tell their stories and be the leaders on telling stories to their communities, where they can already reach thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in the places that they are with relatively low tech stories. So yeah, you heard in my bio, I've been doing that with a young adult fantasy trilogy, which was inspired by good old Twilight, if anyone is old enough to remember that. I remember people just flooding movie theaters and wearing shirts that were like Team Jacob, Team the Other Vampire, just spending massive amounts of their time, money, and energy in this fantasy world on story, wanting to be there. And so I'm working on this thing called Rootbound to create a fantasy world where actually the more time you spend there, the more you'll know about the climate crisis and what you can do about it.
Thank you so much. And it's exciting. We're getting a lot of questions to both of you. So this is great. Thank you so much. I want to turn now to Britt. And Britt, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit how scientists and clinicians can do a better job of communicating.
Yes, absolutely. It says that the host has asked, okay, now my video can come back, great. So, there's many things that can be done to communicate better when researchers are, in a very scientific, empirically based way, of course, being responsible to their work and giving it the technological or technical prowess that it deserves. But this tends to leave a lot of people in the cold. It's not the most accessible way to include jargon or anything that you need a particular education, of course, to grasp, as we see in the film. And this is kind of the unfortunate reputation that a lot of scientists still have, even though many are tremendous communicators. One big way to digest scientific information into something that's more accessible is through the power of narrative, the power of story, the creativity that is available to you as a scientist or a researcher to think about intriguing characters doing surprising things and using that as a vehicle in which to then describe scientific phenomena, your findings, bring it to life in a way that's relatable for a non-expert, of course. Actually, just this week, there was a tremendous resource that was launched called the Climate Storytelling Playbook for Screenwriters. It was created by the Good Energy Project. It's really targeting Hollywood screenwriters to do more of Don't Look Up, to tell more big, bold, brazen climate stories at this time and help narrow the gap between how severe the threat is that we face with climate change, how much political work and attention is being thrown at it, the fight for it, and then our cultural factory, those with the most influence in Hollywood, are not addressing it. A very, very small percentage of films ever mention even one sentence that relates to anything in the climate space, let alone telling a full world in which climate change is a main theme. And so the aim is to get people on board. And I say it's good to go check out that resource, even if you aren't a screenwriter. If you are a scientist, you can go and get ideas about how to infuse sophisticated approaches that incorporate climate psychology, that look at ways in which this crisis is difficult to think about and how it can activate our unconscious defenses that try to protect us from anxiety and pain. Why soft denial is a big element of how people are relating to this, and they'd rather look away. It's easier to look away than have both eyes open to the climate crisis day in, day out. Being aware of that when you are actually holding some of the most important material that helps us understand its phenomena is crucial. So I'll drop that in the chat in a minute. But it's not just stories. I have a PhD in science communication, and I can almost sum up the field there as saying what researchers are showing time and time again is that this thing called the deficit mode of science communication does not work. And this is the old assumption that experts with fancy knowledge can just share a bunch of facts and import them into the non-specialist public as though they are empty vessels that will simply soak it up and then act on those facts in a rational way, which would then create this healthy democracy and people making decisions based on facts and so on and so forth. But we see, of course, that this is not true. People absorb information and make sense of it and act on it according to their own values, identities, deeply held beliefs, which is why, liberals and conservatives can look at the exact same data and go away believing completely different things about it. And so we need to get hip to that as science communicators. We need to understand that it can be much more effective for us to listen, actually, than to tell, and to create relational environments in which some trust can be built for us to have deeper connections and ways of making meaning over scientific information with diverse publics. And this, of course, shifts with every audience we might be trying to reach. Things like deep canvassing, things like motivational interviewing are really important toolkits to look for when trying to do this more heart-centered approach to science communication.
Britt, thank you so much for that context. And it just makes me think that what you're talking about and describing is something that I know our students at UCSF, students of the health professions, would really appreciate and value. It's so relevant and important to their work in providing care. So thank you. And that reference would be wonderful. We're going to shift now to another clip, and I'm going to let Molly take it away.
From a wedding proposal to a little science experiment, I'm going to need a temper rub and a martini
Our
later on.
last guests today have made a pretty big discovery in space. Astronomer Dr. Randall Mindy and PhD candidate Miss Kate Dibiasky are here. Welcome to the show.
Can I ask you one thing before we go any further? I just have to know this. Is there life out there? Can you tell us yes or no? Final answer.
We don't have the data. But sure, in the vastness of space, why not? Yes, aliens are real.
See, I knew I would like this guy. Didn't I tell you you owe me $50?
I'm not saying
I
there's
knew
little
I would
green
like
men
this
in
guy.
flying
Please
saucers.
Sure you
don't
are. That's what you're
encourage
saying.
him.
That's what he's saying.
Dr. Mindy, we'll never get out of here. Now, Jack was having some fun here, you know.
Dad looks great. Doesn't he look good?
They did something with his beard.
You know, with the aliens.
A lot of fun.
He really does.
So much.
Dr. Randall, you'll
Setting a
regret
trend. I knew I
it.
would like this guy.
Now, look, Jax is having some fun here with the aliens or whatever, but there's a New York Herald story that's just come out that talks about a pretty
Keep it right there. You're doing good.
the two of you have made.
That's right, Bree. Kate was observing supernovas in these.
Yeah, that's your girl?
Yeah.
They're not bad.
An absolutely shocking and once in a lifetime discovery.
I had no idea that Subaru made telescopes.
Incredible.
Yeah, so this has to be really exciting. So tell us what you found this time.
I was monitoring exploding stars to help measure the expansion of the universe, and
For your PhD, right?
Yeah.
I saw something I didn't recognize. It was a comet. A big one. It's headed directly at Earth, and it really likely will hit.
This sounds very, very exciting. Exploding stars, like stars actually explode. So how big is this thing? Could it like destroy someone's house? Is that possible?
Well, Comet Dibiasky, which is what it will officially be named, is
After
somewhere.
her? After
yeah,
her.
after her.
Yes, yes.
congratulations.
What an honor. Yeah, right. Congratulations.
It's somewhere between 6 and 9 kilometers across. So
It's big.
it would damage the entire planet, not just a house. You know.
Entire planet. Okay, well, as it's damaging, will it hit this one house in particular that's right on the coast of New Jersey? It's my ex-wife's house. I need it to be hit. Can we make that happen?
You and Shelley have a great relationship. No, you stop.
Listen, in all
You
fairness,
need to stop.
I will, but in all fairness, I actually
Poke you to
paid
death with
for
this
the
cat.
house.
I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry, are we not being clear? We're trying to tell you that the entire planet is about to be destroyed.
Okay.
Okay. Well, it's, you know, just something we do around here. You know, we just keep the bad news light.
Right, it helps the medicine go down. And speaking of medicine, tomorrow we've got a
Well,
two-part...
maybe the destruction of the entire planet isn't supposed to be fun. Maybe it's supposed to be terrifying and unsettling.
Please don't do that.
And you should stay up all
Please.
night, every night, crying. When we're all 100% for sure gonna fucking die!
Hey, Kate.
Okay, we are back. That was an intense part of the film. And I want to shift now, and please continue to put your comments in the Q&A and your feelings. I want to just shift a little bit and talk about this sort of whole idea of, you know, intentional miscommunication. One of the biggest obstacles to governmental and even community action has been the gaslighting, deliberate gaslighting by the fossil fuel industry. Grace, you've done a lot of work in this area, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that research.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I spent the last decade of my life kind of just going into example after example of how the fossil fuel industry has captured our public imagination and blocked government action on climate. And sometimes I think of it as like a metaphor. In my mind, I'm kind of like, we're all out here on this like one football field, you know, trying to come up with our strategy and like play this game and like feel like we're advancing, you know, moving the ball a little bit. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, we're not even on the right field because the fossil fuel industry is over here playing nobody because they've so redirected our energy. And some examples of how they do that is, I think the biggest one is that they know that the power in climate is in behavioral social science, in political action, and in ideas and storytelling. And they've invested billions of dollars in that. And we know massive corporations like that, they don't invest money unless they think they're getting a return. They have some of the most private evidence on how to kind of influence the public in the world, right? All of this $2 billion in market research a year that corporations do. And they have been kind of seeding these ideas for decades throughout society. And they do this, and then they build this social capital, and then they call up those ideas later. So I was mentioning that there's this one example that's very clear. You can check it out. And as this is based in California, but United Latinos Vote is a new kind of front group associated with the fossil fuel industry. They've shown that it's getting donations from the fossil fuel industry, and the fossil fuel industry is taking any of its press releases and kind of blasting it out to their networks. And this group has been challenging all of progressive climate legislation in California. And I'm not talking progressive politically, I mean like making change on the front of climate, and arguing that it unfairly impacts racialized folks. But the actual head of kind of the Racial Justice Alliance in the state has kind of torn into this group, saying that they're co-opting the language and the movement of racial justice in kind of an especially cruel way, because it's these communities who are on the front lines of not just climate change, but also, you know, air pollution, all of the other things that go along. And so having the fossil fuel industry kind of like seed this fake group. And that's one of, I could give you hundreds of examples of how they're doing that. They do it across kind of nonprofit, civil society. They invest hundreds of millions of dollars in universities to buy social capital there. And then we see, for example, when those universities try to divest, that because the universities are used to that money, they actually start parroting fossil fuel industry talking points. And I'm not saying intentionally, but they don't want to lose that money. And universities have so much social capital in a society, of course. One of the scariest parts for me, and what I've spent a lot of my PhD research focusing on, is how they've targeted children as young as 5. I mean, they write stories for them. The fossil fuel industry writes picture books for children. Like, that's how we know stories are important. If corporations are doing it, they have like a financial obligation to their bottom line. So they're subtly telling us that stories are where it's at. In the late 1990s, when the Kyoto Protocol became this massive threat to fossil fuel industry interests, when we really had this moment of potential global action, they kicked in the fossil fuel industry to make sure we didn't take that action. And they created this kind of comprehensive plan, and the heads of every major fossil fuel industry was aware of this. They were aware of the climate science. In fact, they were at the cutting edge of the climate science by the late 1970s. And one of the tactics was to go after teachers and students, specifically to make them skeptical about climate science, to prevent future voters from taking on something like the Kyoto Protocol. That is decades of planning to pollute our public imagination. And so it's why I just think storytelling is so important. But we can't just tell our own stories. We really have to highlight and expose what the fossil fuel industry is doing, because they're continuing to do this. They're now holding themselves out as climate leaders. As we see these horrible travesties in geopolitics, they're saying they have the answers. And actually, you know, like another basic example is carbon tax in Washington state. We had a chance, it was going to pass, $30 million funded by the fossil fuel industry to make sure that that carbon tax didn't pass, even though those fossil fuel industry groups said that they supported carbon taxes. And so now here they're saying they're leaders, they're going to take action on this, and without really holding them to account for their last decades of manipulation. It's not that they provided us energy. That's not what I'm upset about. What I'm upset about is that they manipulated us for 4-5 decades and delayed climate action for just as long.
Grace, this really reminds me of, it's like a playbook that you probably, saw with the tobacco industry and other industries who, so I'm just curious if you see it that way, and it's this very intentional, strategic, manipulative undermining of democracy, and putting corporate profits over public health.
Absolutely. It's the exact same playbook. In fact, they use the same PR firms, the same scientists. There's these 5 tactics, and they're not the only corporations to do it. It's actually becoming an incredibly common tactic because, as you know, the tobacco industry in the 1970s said doubt is our product, because they knew it was easier to create doubt than to fight the policy change. So they started fighting the science and raising uncertainty around it. And, this is all intense and overwhelming. But what's so interesting is that it's relatively easy to push back against the propaganda once we can see it. And that's what kind of the youth movement is showing. And we saw fossil fuel industry interest get so terrified of these youth, of Greta Thunberg, of lots of other youth. And I think that's what's so interesting, is they know their billions of dollars can't hold up against that kind of movement. Not that it's on children and young people to take the action, but just that, like, the very cool thing about culture and hope and story is that they spread quickly. We don't have to wait for the tech and the financial. You can have a sea change year and then change political will, change voters, change the hearts and minds. It really can happen exponentially. And that's what's so exciting and why I'm in that space.
Well, and that's also a very hopeful message to be to be holding close to our hearts while we really kind of grapple with this. So thank you. Dan, I was wondering if we could shift a little, and NRDC has really been engaged on the front line with these kinds of battles. Could you talk a little bit about what NRDC is engaged with right now?
Certainly. And before I do that, I just wanted to say that I think the work that Grace is doing, this kind of taxonomy of fraud by the fossil fuel industry is absolutely vital. And Grace, correct me if I'm wrong, but you asked about the playbook. Is it like, what's happened with the tobacco industry? As she said, of course, it's exactly like that, and it uses many of the same experts. But I think it's at a much bigger scale. And we've seen this happen with the sugar industry and other industries as well. But I don't think any of it compares to what the fossil fuel industry has done. So yeah, we do need to shine a light on it. And frankly, I think that Grace's work is to some extent a roadmap for Hollywood creators. There's so many fantastic suspense stories, conspiracy stories to be told here. And I hope that we start to see that happen. Sure. In terms of, NRDC, we're best known for developing kind of cutting edge environmental policies, for suing polluters and suing the government in court. We do all of those things, but we do a lot more. Essentially we work to ensure the rights of all people to the air, the water, the wild, and to prevent special interests from undermining public interest. Our areas of work, climate is absolutely dominant, and it extends through all of the other work, but the other work includes a huge focus on communities, on energy, water, food, health, the oceans, the wild. And, we work from the community level up, and we work from the top down. We do both things. Across the country, we're partners with frontline communities in battles over polluting facilities of all kinds that have historically been foisted upon low-income communities of color. That means working together with those communities to shut down power plants, incinerators, to make sure that polluting facilities aren't located in communities that are already overburdened. It means developing policies that will clean up and electrify some of our most polluting facilities. For instance, major seaports is a big focus of our work. We also work to create standards and policies that require or incentivize energy efficiency. And we do that not only in the United States, but significantly in China. On the climate front, we work at all levels of government to adopt clean energy laws and policies. Last fall, NRDC played a very large role in developing and passing a massive clean energy bill in Illinois. It was NRDC, just think back to the Obama administration, that worked with his EPA to develop the Clean Power Plan, which unfortunately has been bogged down in litigation. But today we are pushing Congress and the administration to implement the climate justice and the infrastructure agenda that President Biden has put forth. In terms of the oceans and the wild, there's one issue that's particularly dear to my heart. The last film I made for NRDC is called Sonic Sea, and it's about ocean noise pollution. It was an outgrowth of work that we've been doing for decades to try to stop the increasing volume of industrial and military ocean noise that's devastating the ocean, whales and fish and invertebrates. The ocean is an acoustic environment, and we are now introducing ungodly amounts of noise into it and ruining life in the ocean. What's interesting about this issue is that it's easily solvable. It's not as intractable as climate or as, toxic pollution in the ocean. It's something we can fix in a few years if we decide to do it. So those are some of the issues that we're working on. And, I feel very privileged to work at NRDC and be able to support that on the communication side.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And I did pop the Sonic Sea film in the chat for everyone. So if you wanted, I encourage you to check it out. We are going to shift for the sake of time because, geez, this is so rich. And I'd like to encourage us to think of this as a beginning of a conversation. So we can certainly keep it going after this event tonight. But let's move on to another clip from the movie. And I'm going to ask Molly to go ahead and cue it up.
What's the hold up, guys? What are you waiting on? Come on, motherfuckers, let's light this fucking firecracker, huh? Think I got all day?
Commander Drask, this is your president speaking. Your nation thanks you. Your planet thanks you. And God and I thank you.
Listen, the only thanks I need is a shot of Jack Daniels. And a couple of DUIs to magically go away.
This is Mission Control. All indicators are coming up green. This is a final warning to control the launch pad.
Your discovery led to this mission and our chance to save Earth. I give you the honor.
Thank you, Madam President. Citizens of planet Earth, everything is theoretically impossible until it is done. And with that, we are go for launch.
Shots fired. The win.
Hey, everyone, mind if I join? Hello.
Hello, Peter. Hi.
Hi. Oh, Bree, you look fabulous, as always.
Is he allowed to be in here?
Yeah, he's a Platinum Eagle level donor to the campaign, so he has full clearance.
Launch mission array.
Molly kicking in right now. I timed that shit perfect.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4,
Probably should go to the hospital and see what they...
Everyone, I have just received some critical information concerning our mission.
It looks like it's turning around.
No, it's not. It's a course correction. It's pretty standard. I was in the Navy.
No? It's turning around.
There seems to be some confusion here amongst the crowd, but I'm not going to lie to you. This reporter is at a loss for words right now. Yep, it's definitely turning around. I'm looking straight at it. Drask's ship is definitely turning around.
Does anyone know what the fuck just happened?
Our allies are very confused and demanding answers.
We'll tell them to wait. According to the most recent spectrometer readings of Comet Dibiasky, made by the astrogeologists at Bash Cellular, we've discovered something. Something truly miraculous. Peter. Peter?
Oh, thank you, Janie. As some of you may know, the most valuable minerals in the world are fast becoming those that are deployed in the manufacture of cell phones and computers. Yttrium, terbium, osmium, dysprosium, on and on and on. We're running short. And the problem is exacerbated, of course, because China has her big panda paw firmly on almost all the mines that produce these valuable rare earth acids. So you can imagine, wow, just how happy we were at Bash from when our astrogeologists discovered and then determined that this comet hurtling towards us from deep space actually contains at least $32 trillion of these critical materials, critical to technology.
I'm sorry, is that why you aborted this entire mission? Is because you're trying to mine the comet
Dr.
for
Mindy,
rare
I
minerals?
think we should hold all questions until the end of the presentation, and you might find that your questions are answered.
Yes, Madam President.
When the other metals are factored in, the comet actually contains almost $140 trillion worth of assets.
Fuck 40 trillion.
Yeah.
What do these trillions of dollars even matter if we're all going to die from the impact
I was
of
about
this
to ask
comet?
the same question, Janie.
Yeah, Janie, why weren't we consulted?
In all due respect, Madam
Oh,
President.
no,
this
what
is
if we're
highly
rich
dangerous.
and we're
Oh, come
safe?
on.
It's insane, like completely insane.
It will never work.
I had the exact same reaction.
This is a 9-kilometer wide planet killer we're talking about, not roaming charges.
Look, I was confused and outraged that they turned this mission around too. But they've got Gary Talcott from Stanford and Lisa Ness from Princeton on their team. I mean, this is next generation cutting edge technology.
Obviously, one giant comet is a major and existential threat to our planet, but 30 smaller meteoroids we can handle. Our beads, that stands for Bash, Explore and Acquire drones, as you see here, attach themselves to the comet and scan it with nanotechnology developed by a Nobel Prize winning scientist, Dr. Gary Talcott. And then we immediately deploy, don't we, Nobel and Pulaski Prize winning scientist, Dr. Inez's micro-targeted quantum fission explosives, you see, deep into the object Dr. Ness, would you like to explain what's happening?
Thank you, Peter. We've been developing phase fission reactions in the CERN particle accelerator that can splinter the comet into smaller pieces with breathtaking accuracy. These segments are then steered and decelerated by each bead into the Pacific Ocean for reclamation by waiting U.S. Navy ships.
And when these, thank you, and when these treasures from heaven are claimed, poverty as we know it, social injustice, loss of biodiversity, all these multitudes of problems are just going to become relics of the past. And humanity is going to stride through the pillars of Boaz and Joachim naked into the glory of a golden age.
And is this nanotech work peer reviewed? Well, I haven't reviewed the data, but it's been modeled.
Has any of this been peer reviewed?
No.
Interplanetary, interstellar, intergalactic existence for the human race. That's what we're
I understand the wealth that they can extract from this comet. They can end world hunger.
I see.
Why are you laughing?
I see. No, I see. So that's the pretty little bow that they're putting around this line of bullshit.
I bet they're gonna save freedom and puppies too.
All right, you want them to quit the mission? I'll quit the mission. That's fine. But you have to understand, this is now beyond our control. They have all the power. So who do you want in actual room to make sure this whole thing doesn't turn out to be a complete goddamn disaster? Jason Marlene? Is Jason Marlene in that room? Huh?
I have news for you. It's already a complete disaster. They're talking about letting a comet the size of a mountain hit the planet to jack up a cell phone company's stock.
You gotta take that down about 4 or 5 notches down.
Were you just yelling about why they turned that mission around? Why were you talking about cell phones?
My friend was just theorizing as to what's going on. We're confused too.
That's an awfully official-looking White House badge you got there.
I don't know why I have this on. I don't know.
Listen, just tell us what's going on.
I got 3 scared kids at home. How about you just tell us something?
I understand. I wish I could share information.
We're people just like you. We deserve to know.
They're right. They deserve to know. Do you really want to know what's going on?
Kate, don't. Kate.
They found a bunch of gold and diamonds and rare shit on the comet. So they're gonna let it hit the planet to make a bunch of rich people even more disgustingly rich.
Okay, so that was an intense scene that really talks about, I think, in some ways, the whole injustice of the issue, this idea of climate injustice. And, you know, Indigenous people have been really trying to raise awareness about this climate catastrophe for across the globe for some time, and restore balance. Even though they live in communities that are the most impacted. And I was wondering if you, Lisa and Abe, could talk about some of your work with these Indigenous leaders and communities.
Abe, do you want to start this time?
Yeah, for sure. I think the fundamental question when we're thinking about issues of climate justice is not just what is going to happen, but what do we lose along the way? We know that warming is happening, and we know that we're going to lose things. And it's not just the natural environment, but people, cultures, traditions, ways of life, knowledge paradigms. And so that's what I really think of when we're talking about the climate injustice that we face, because it's clear that the communities that are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis are not the issues that not the communities that caused the issue in the first place, but also the communities that are likely least equipped to fight the climate crisis and the impacts of the climate crisis today. And we see that great injustice there, the communities that contribute least to the problem experiencing the most of the impact. That's the root of the climate crisis right there. And in the study that Britt was talking about earlier with 10,000 youth around the world, the youth that were actually experiencing and reporting the greatest amount of climate distress were youth in the Philippines, India, Nigeria, and Brazil. They reported the highest scores of climate distress. And again, within the states and across North America, we understand that indigenous communities, Black communities, racialized communities are the communities that are experiencing the brunt of the impacts of the climate crisis the most. And so as it comes to that question of climate justice, then, we might ask that next question. Sure, we understand that certain communities are experiencing and will continue to experience the impacts of the climate crisis at a disproportionate rate. But when we think of the mental health impacts of the climate crisis, we might wonder, especially after looking at a movie like Don't Look Up, isn't it just privileged, wealthy, white people that are complaining about mental health? Isn't it just those that are in Hollywood that are making a big deal out about it? And again, we talked about this a bit earlier in terms of the messaging and how this movie might alienate some people. You may not think that this movie resonates with you, but actually, when we're looking at those that are disproportionately affected, again, it's actually those communities that experience the greatest mental health burdens of climate change. But the language that climate distress may be talked about in may be a bit different. So instead of talking about anxiety, maybe we're talking about existential dread or eco-grief. And to your question, Anne-Marie, in the work that I've done and my team has done in connecting with Inuit youth in the Arctic and connecting these youth in conversations, youth have talked about, yes, climate change is happening. And while permafrost might be melting in their communities, what that actually signifies is a greater loss of culture, because that means that elders aren't able to go out hunting to get seal at typical rates. Whereas sea ice patterns used to be extremely predictable, they no longer are, and people are becoming injured, people are dying going out hunting. And so again, what we may look at as a physical impact of climate change, an economic cost associated with climate change, is actually at a community level in the communities that are the most impacted. Infringements on the ability for culture to continue to survive. And so that's really the brunt of the issue, I think. And as we think of those that experience those greater mental health impacts of climate change, again, we're talking about farmers. Farmer suicide are at all-time high around the world. If we look at India and the state that I was born in, India, Punjab, farmer suicides, there's an epidemic going on. And a lot of that is rooted in unpredictability of crop yields. Again, that is rooted in the climate crisis. And I think it's disingenuous to say that we can't actually connect the impacts of the climate crisis to the mental health impacts of those that are disproportionately affected. And I guess I'll end before passing it on to Lisa with just the question of what can we do when we're thinking about those that are disproportionately affected. Again, those with wealth and power will do what they can to, again, avert action on the climate crisis. Grace wonderfully described how the fossil fuel industry has been involved in deliberate misinformation and misinformation campaigns. And so what do we do? I think ultimately what is the role of each of us is to connect and uplift paradigms that, knowledge paradigms that aren't in the mainstream right now. And so I know that in the chat, a few folks were mentioning connecting with nature and how that makes you feel grounded. I mean, again, I talk about climate change. I work with youth about climate change, and the new information brought to me in this conversation today is alarming. We can't continue as we are going today. But what that means then is to uplift existing information, indigenous knowledge systems, supporting those that are on the ground doing the work. While the film talks about those that have power, using their power to raise awareness about the issue, I don't think the film does a great job talking about those that are actually on the front lines and are doing that work. And so I think, again, connecting to spirituality, connecting to traditional paradigms, connecting to nature, that's really where the work is. And I'll pass it on to Lisa to really build on that issue of climate injustice.
I mean, I think, just to sort of speak to some other points, after the hurricane in Puerto Rico, we saw what we usually see after a tremendous disaster, right? Spiking in PTSD, depression, anxiety, and suicide. And there is really this confluence of sort of, let's not call it a natural disaster alone, right? It's centuries of abuses to our planet and to the island that people have had to sustain. And this sort of acute event is sort of the thing that just sort of really burst it open, right? And So when elders and young people come together, I think it really has been an intergenerational response, which I think we can learn from, because the misinformation, the control and the powers that have the resource to do something or not. If you remember in Puerto Rico, they were saying nothing happened here. Nobody really died when there were thousands of people who died. And so that sort of layers of injustice, I think, is what can really harm people from a mental health perspective. So it's the climate change, it's the injustice, it's the dehumanization, it's the political loss of power, right? And I think what's the aftermath of sort of the pushback once people came back from being numb and depressed, right, is to almost riot, like in that film, right? There were riots around the injustices. And then the elders, and I think the young people, it was sort of the two groups started to come together and fight in terms of from their perspective, right? So the elders in terms of their knowledge and their ability to think about these ways that we can learn about our environment, like in Puerto Rico, you know, sort of really fighting for protections of lands and continue to work with Vieques and solar, all those things that a lot of very strong elder leaders were involved in. Also sort of supported the students, right, in the University of Puerto Rico, who also started their own movement and continue to have their movement around environmental justice issues and climate change. So it really took sort of the community getting angry, right, and sort of saying, we are pushing back and we're going to do this. And so I think the only challenge is to sustain that. Like so many other things that we're experiencing right now, how do we sustain the energy and the movement of pushing back against the misinformation and the injustices and making the change that we can? So I'll leave it to there, weaving some of the things that we've been talking about so far.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa and Abe. I mean, in many ways, it sounds, you know, what you're really talking about is sort of this whole ecosystem, you know, looking at it holistically, everything is connected, and really responding in that way as well. I wanted to, for the sake of time, because we still wanted to get a little, have a couple minutes for audience members to ask questions. I'm going to ask everyone, all of our panelists, to just give us, we kind of prepped for, you know, what is your thought, one thing about what people can do to act, to have hope for the future. And if you could, you know, just in a very brief way, share what your thoughts are about that with the audience before we turn to additional questions from the audience. I think that might be a really lovely way to close this evening. And again, for the audience members, for the participants, we are going to make a recording of this available on the UCSF Sustainability and Earth Center websites. And I encourage you to reach out to any of us if you would like to have follow-up information or get in touch with any of the panelists. So I'm going to, we can do this, I can just do this popcorn style unless someone wants to volunteer and say, I'm ready to share what my thoughts are about what you can do to have, take action and have hope for the future. I'm seeing Dan smiling, like maybe Dan and Grace, you're both, you have the biggest smiles, and then maybe Abe. Oh, no, you know, I see Britt, and I think it's all coming together. So why don't you just decide amongst yourself? Grace, do you want to go?
Sure, I'm going to go. I'm going to be really annoying because I'm going to give two things. But I just want to underline Lisa and Abe's point. A recent report just came out that Indigenous peoples have blocked or delayed a quarter of North America's greenhouse gas emissions with their resistance. That is unbelievable. They are doing that with so little money and resources. They are not just the ones most impacted, they are the ones fighting the hardest. We are seeing them literally put life and limb on the line. So support frontline defenders in any way you possibly can. And then two, you got to vote. You got to vote in every possible thing, your school election, your bank election, anything, because that is the political will that we're talking about. If you're not quite sure what that looks like, the Environmental Voter Project is an incredible nonpartisan group getting out the climate vote and building bold climate political will in the US. And I'll be working with them a lot this year.
Thank you,
Daniel.
Thank you.
Sure, you got to vote. You got to get involved in the democratic process. You have to talk about climate change with everybody in your life, especially the people who aren't really on board. Your power as an advocate is so important. And it's also important because it helps you process your feelings about it and focus your energy about it.
Thank you.
I'll go. I mean, I think it's so important to talk and amplify the stories, right? We're saying which has a strategy that there's many ways to amplify those stories as an educator, as activism, walking, accompanying those who are in the front lines and struggling. And then I think also asking young people about what they're experiencing. We saw the statistics, especially if you're providers, asking and supporting young people through those very challenging emotions about what our future is.
I can jump in. I honestly think that hopelessness is very underrated. I think that there's a powerful invitation that comes with finding yourself in a place of profound hopelessness because of how overwhelming the threat is. The feelings are incredibly challenging, but there's nothing permanent about that space of feeling hopeless. It can actually be incredibly motivating for finding a way to make meaning from this mess that we're in. Often that meaning that one can make requires attaching our talents and our efforts and the hours in our day to working with others on it. It can really be a portal through which we get involved and find this existential valve within ourselves that allows us to direct all of our life force at this. And when we do that, we start to create hope. Hope is a verb. It's not this thing that's out there that we need in order to get going. And so in that sense, I think that we really need to allow ourselves to feel the full immensity of the emotions that come with being alive at this time, and then work together to productively channel them towards that verb of creating hope.
Thank you, Britt. Abe.
Yeah, looks like I'm last. Again, I'm on a panel of superstars, and this is so exciting. I think bringing this together, I think, combining a lot of this, I think it starts at the level of community. Where do you hold spheres of influence, and how do you connect with those identities and within those spheres of influence? And how can you bring your passions in? Grace talked about storytelling. Daniel's doing Netflix, movie making. This is all so exciting. And I think everything here allows us to connect our own passions with community. Like I've been playing hockey since I was 5 years old. I have a hockey game out in the background right now in true Canadian fashion. And I've been looking at how to mitigate emissions within the sports world. And again, I'm starting my career in this, but I know that by combining my passions where my community aligns, that's how you can create spheres of influence at an individual and build that up to the collective level.
Thank you, Abe. I was jotting down notes because I was just so inspired. I have my next bumper sticker. Hope is a verb. This is really, thank you. And this is a beautiful way to close this session, very helpful and meaningful. And I was wondering if we could ask Robin Cooper now to provide a couple of thoughts, questions. I know we've been scanning the Q&A to see if there are additional questions from the audience, but I'm going to turn it over to Robin now to help us pull that last piece together.
I'm not sure I can do justice to this incredible panel that has offered so much. I am in awe of all of you. Just as I followed the chat or the question and answer, I've kind of pulled together some themes, and I'm just going to say them rather quickly and see if there are comments from our panelists, and I do have some closing comments. It is very clear that over and over, coping with these feelings, the audience has said, action, 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 action. That's great, because that's what we hope would come out of this. There have also been themes around what Lisa and Abe have been talking about in terms of injustice. What Lisa has said are the layers of injustice. And there's an important comment from one of the attendees bringing in the just transition for workers who are going to need to move into spaces of jobs that are in the clean energy sector. Lots of comments and lots of interest in the area of that intentional, deliberate misinformation that both Grace and Daniel have spoken about, and expanding it to those areas of financial or corporate sectors where the accumulation of wealth is such a driving force, the part of the clip, the piece in the very last clip. And then the issues around climate denial. And one specific idea that I wondered about was this term that Britt had brought up of soft denial, that I think is an important concept. Maybe just a moment on that, and then I do have some closing thoughts.
Was that directed for me?
Yeah, just give us a second about what soft, gentle denial is.
So Grace has done a brilliant job of introducing us to the tactics of hardcore denial, let's call it that, right? Corporate malfeasance, something that people are doing consciously in order to protect their profits. However, soft denial is something that we all unwittingly participate in to different degrees because it's unconscious. We, for many good reasons, have evolved these psychological defenses that allow us to turn away from reality when it's really intolerable, really painful. We all kind of have to lie to ourselves sometimes to get through life when things are really rough and tough. However, when it comes to the climate crisis, there's this particular form of soft denial called disavowal. It's really interesting because it might resonate with you as something that you do. I know it does for me. It basically means having one eye open to the truth of the climate crisis, believing it's really important, saying, yes, we ought to muster the political will. The scientists are right. Oh my gosh, I'm so outraged at all the hardcore deniers, etc. Simultaneously, we close the other eye to the truth and we hop on the next plane. We don't quit our job in a polluting industry, right? We have our pension tied up in fossil fuel investments in order to make more money, whatever it might be. And then that really thwarts our ability to act. And we get stuck when we're in that place. It's kind of this split existence that many of us are living with. So that's just one form of soft denial, but there are others. And it's tough to really have no denial, no defense against this because it's a painful thing to deal with.
So true. So true. I'm just checking in. Anne Marie, do we have time, or are we going to move to our closing comments? Are you with me?
I am with you, and I think that we are at just about at the hour. So, and I do believe, looking through the Q&A, that a lot of questions have been answered. There've been a lot of really incredible. So thank you, panelists, for answering those questions. And there were a lot of comments too. Yes, please.
Lively conversation in the Q&A, and I'm so delighted about that. I just want to call your attention. Molly Burke has been putting a lot of URLs and resources into the Q&A. Our challenge, as Britt has said, is that now that we have looked up, we have to face, what do we do once we know? How do we manage that soft denial? And the challenge is to manage those feelings in a tolerable way, to do also what Britt has said, that hope is a verb, and we need to move into those spheres of effective action. And I kind of organized this in my P's for participation, for action. What do you do in your private sphere? Vote, vote, vote has been said. What do you do in your public sphere? Abbe has said, be effective in the communities within you have influence. What do we do in our professional sphere? How do we mobilize our professional organizations? And then Dan has said, translating into the most effective places, which is having an influence on policies. It is in the realm of policies that we have to move in from all of those places to be able to create the kinds of solutions and be able to have a better future for the world that we and our children will be living in. To all of you, and I almost forgot one thing. To the UCS students here, thank you for waiting, Anne Marie, for that. There is a climate challenge. It's in the question and answer. You can participate if you are any student at UCSF in that climate challenge by committing yourself to one action, and it's in the chat, the question and answer, the URL, and you will get a $10 gift certificate to a sustainable organization. But do not, any of us, be motivated by a little $10 gift certificate. The benefits of action are much greater than that.
Thank you, Robin. And I, on behalf of our team and our community, I really want to thank all of our panelists for being here with us this evening, and participants for joining us. And we're very grateful for you spending the time and giving us hope and tangible things we can do, very doable things to keep that hope alive and to feel okay with being hopeless, because that's a good motivator. So thank you all. And to the future we want to see, may it be. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing us all together.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.